We are continuing our study of Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, and as we've seen, the sermon begins with Jesus pronouncing a series of blessings. 4 of the blessings have to do with our relationship with God, and the other 4 have to do with our relationship with other people. And this is the first of those descriptions of Christ followers and how they relate to others. And we're described here as being meek. Now, before we get into what that means, we need to set the context here of the book of Matthew so far. Jesus has come into Galilee, and he's come proclaiming a message. Matthew chapter 4, verse 17 tells us, from that time Jesus began to preach, saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And so Jesus comes into Galilee with this message. He is announcing the arrival of the kingdom, and implicit in that announcement is the declaration that he is the promised ruler that had been spoken of in the Old Testament prophets. He was their long-awaited Messiah. Now, the Jewish people of the first century were in fact looking for the Messiah. They were expecting his arrival, but they had some false expectations about what exactly that would look like and what it is that he would do. They read the prophecies of the Messiah, that he would conquer the nations, that he would establish his rule, his kingdom from Jerusalem. And so they assumed that this Messiah, this promised ruler that God was going to send to them, would be a military leader, someone who would lead a rebellion and would free them from the Roman occupation. Rome had conquered Israel at this time in history, and so during the days of Jesus, the Jews were living as prisoners in their own land. Roman soldiers were in their streets as the police force. They were forced to pay taxes to the Roman Empire. And the Jewish people longed for the day that the Messiah would come, overthrow the Romans, and bring freedom to the nation of Israel. And this is what they thought Jesus was going to do. This is, by the way, what Jesus' own apostles thought that he was going to do, even quite late into his ministry. Luke chapter 19, verse 11 says, "As they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable, because he was near to Jerusalem, and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately." So they were expecting, we're headed into Jerusalem, Jesus is going to go in, he's going to assemble his army to go and fight against Rome. This is what they were anticipating all along the way as he's traveling to Jerusalem. Even though Jesus at this point had tried to explain to them several times that actually I'm going there to die. I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be tried, I'm going to be put to death. But the disciples didn't ever seem to really grasp what he was saying, because they just had it fixed in their mind that the Messiah was going to free them from the Romans. After Jesus' death, the disciples were confused. In fact, they started to wonder, maybe Jesus isn't the Messiah after all. On the road to Emmaus, 2 of Jesus' disciples were speaking about him, and this is what they say, Luke 24, verse 18. One of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" He said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." So they had this expectation of Jesus. He's the one who's going to restore our nation. He's going to give us back our freedom from Rome. But now he's dead, and so their hopes are crushed. And even after Jesus rises from the dead, the disciples still don't get it. Acts chapter 1, verse 6. When they came together, they asked him, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" They're still hung up on this issue. Even after Jesus dies, rises again, they're like, okay, maybe now it's time to go and fight. Pilate was confused as well. During Jesus' trial, he asked Jesus a series of questions about, what does it mean that you're the king of the Jews? And here's Jesus' response. Basically, Pilate, I think, is trying to feel out whether Jesus is really a threat to Rome or not, whether he's trying to lead a rebellion and take over. And Jesus says in John 18, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." So Jesus tries to explain to Pilate here, I am a king, I am bringing a kingdom, but it's not a kingdom like you're used to. If I were here to overthrow the Romans and set up my earthly kingdom, then Peter would have been right to take out his sword when they came to arrest Jesus. But the kingdom of Christ isn't like other kingdoms of the world. It doesn't come through fighting and through military conquest. And so this leads to the question, if Christ's kingdom doesn't come through force, like all other kingdoms do, a kingdom usually begins by overthrowing the previous rule and establishing yourself as the leader. If that's not the way that the kingdom of Christ comes into being, then how does it? How is it that Christ's rule is going to extend and these prophecies are going to be fulfilled of him ruling and reigning over the world? And the surprising answer is through meekness. This brings us to our text, Matthew 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Which is just another way of saying the meek are going to take over the world. They're going to take possession of the earth, which is absurd. It's sort of like Jesus said previously, happy are the sad. It's something that seems ridiculous on its face. Most would say that taking possession of the earth can only be accomplished through being strong and aggressive and tyrannical. But that's not the way of Jesus. That's not how his kingdom operates. So when the disciples of Christ expect he's going to go into Jerusalem, assemble an army, and lead a rebellion against Rome, Jesus intentionally doesn't enter the city riding on some magnificent horse prepared for battle. No, he comes into the city meek, riding on a donkey. And it would have seemed even more absurd years later when Jesus is being put to death by the Romans. So much for meekness being the path to world domination. But then a couple of centuries later, that same Roman Empire that seemed impossible to overthrow was in fact conquered by the kingdom of Christ, and it came under his rule. The Roman emperor even declared Rome to be a Christian nation. He ordered the printing of Bibles to be dispersed throughout the empire. And it wasn't conquered through power or through military force, but through meekness, through martyrs who loved not their lives even unto death. This is the way of Jesus. He conquers not through force, but through meekness. Now, what is meekness? We've talked about this before, but meekness doesn't mean weakness. It's not the idea of being timid or shy like we often use the word today. The Greek word here is used in classical Greek literature to describe a wild horse that has been broken and brought under control. So that's, I think, a good image for us to get in our minds. A horse that's been broken, that's been subdued. The horse still possesses strength and power, but it's not out of control. It is subdued to the rider's will. That is what it means to be meek. For the Christian, meekness is being submissive to God. Rather than seeking your own interests and acting out of whatever impulses you might have, you are instead submitting to the will of God, and you have self-control. Maybe a word that will help us get a clear understanding here is the word restraint. To be meek is to act with restraint. So here are some biblical examples of meekness to help you get a better idea of what this looks like. First, Genesis chapter 13. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed on from Negeb as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great they could not dwell together. There was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, I will go to the left." This is meekness. Abram doesn't insist on his own way. He allows Lot to choose where he would like to settle, where he would like to take his animals. And whatever Lot chooses, Abram says, "I'll go the other direction." So there's an example of what it is to be meek, to show deference. Second example of meekness, Genesis chapter 50. Joseph, of course, you remember, had been sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. Famine had come. They had come to Egypt in search of food. Joseph reunites with his family. He moves them all to Egypt. They survive the famine. And then Joseph's father, Jacob, dies. And now that the father has died, the brothers are concerned that maybe Joseph will seek retaliation. Maybe he's only restrained himself from taking vengeance on them for their father's sake. And so verse 15 says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, 'Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of your God and your father.' Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' But Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones.' Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them." That's meekness. Third example, Numbers chapter 12. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" And the Lord heard it. So Miriam and Aaron, these are Moses' brother and sister, and they attack Moses. They begin to criticize him. But Moses doesn't respond. He doesn't attack them. He doesn't lash back. He doesn't even really defend himself. Instead, we're told this, verse 3, "Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth." And then the verses that follow, God responds. God is very angry with Miriam and Aaron for attacking Moses in this way, and so he strikes Miriam with leprosy. Moses cries out to God to heal her. And so basically, the story shows God defending Moses rather than Moses defending himself because he was meek. He didn't retaliate. He didn't attack them. He responded with humility and restraint, even when he was criticized. Fourth example, 2 Samuel 16. David was king over Israel, a powerful king. Absalom, his son, was seeking to take the throne from David. He's leading a rebellion against his own father, and so David is kind of on the run at this point. 2 Samuel 16, verse 5. When King David came to Bahurim, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. And as he came, he cursed continually, and he threw stones at David, and at all the servants of King David, and all the people, and all the mighty men who were on his right hand and on his left. And Shimei said as he cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood." Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head." The king said, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David,' who then shall say, 'Why have you done so?'" And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, "Behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjaminite? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today." So David and his men went on the road, while Shimei went along on the hillside opposite him, and cursed as he went, and threw stones at him, and flung dust. Here David displays great meekness. David is traveling here with his mighty men. You read of them listed in other portions of the book of 2 Samuel. He could have given an order. He could have had this man killed. Instead, he tells his men, calm down, leave him alone, let him curse. Fifth and final example, of meekness is Jesus himself. Jesus is famously described as being meek and lowly in heart, and there are many examples of Christ acting with meekness. Here's one. Luke chapter 9, verse 51. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" So James and John, not great examples of meekness here. They're being rash, they're out of control, they're acting out of their self-interest. Verse 55, he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. Jesus only did what he was instructed to by his Father. That is his meekness. He humbly obeyed even to the point of death on the cross. And so Jesus is the ultimate example of meekness. Now, I want to pause at this point and just speak to the men for a minute, if I can. Because in the West, we've all been discipled by our feminist culture to view masculinity as a bad thing. Masculinity is toxic, or so we're told. But God made men to be masculine and strong. The Bible is clear from Genesis on that God designed men to be leaders in a way he did not design women. God made men to be strong. Masculinity is a good thing. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." God designed men to be strong. And unfortunately, evangelicals in America have largely given in to the liberal feminists who have taken over the authority structures of our culture. We've been sort of afraid to defend masculinity because of its abuses, and so we've caved. And now these feminists have sort of are running or beginning to run our country, our judicial system, our courts, our government, and even our churches. Now, there's a reaction to this, the sort of war on masculinity that's taking place in our culture, which is the cheap imitation of Andrew Tate and his ilk. Boys pretending to be men by bragging constantly, seeking to impress and intimidate people, using and abusing women. They preach that domination over the weak makes you strong. But this isn't true masculinity. It is a cheap imitation. True masculinity isn't insecure. Real men don't need to prove their toughness by acting impulsively and pushing others down who are weaker than themselves to lift themselves up. True strength is described by the words of Proverbs chapter 16, which says, "Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." That's real strength. That is biblical masculinity. This is what it means to be a man as God intended you to be. Strength that is controlled, that is used for the benefit of others, rather than using and abusing people for your own interests. Meek men defend others rather than themselves. When Moses was attacked by Miriam and Aaron, he didn't get defensive. He didn't seek to bash them, criticize them, retaliate against them because he was meek. But that doesn't mean Moses was soft. When God was dishonored at Mount Sinai, it was Moses who took the golden calf that the people were worshiping, ground it down to powder, mixed it with water, and made the people drink it. Moses didn't get defensive of himself when he was being attacked, but he wasn't afraid to act when God was being dishonored. And we are told that he was the meekest man on the earth. Similarly, Jesus, when he himself was being mocked and made fun of during his trial, he said nothing in response. He didn't seek to lift himself up to respond in anger. He was restrained. When Christ was ridiculed on the cross, he endured it without retaliation, without threatening. The one who could have called legions of angels to slaughter his enemies allowed himself to be spit upon, mocked, and crucified. But that same Jesus, when he saw the poor being taken advantage of, made a whip, and in a very intentional fit of rage, he drove the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem out of the temple and threw their tables across the room. This is the picture of someone we're told is meek and lowly in heart. Meekness is restraint. It is strength that is channeled and productive, strength that is intentional. When Jesus was arrested, Peter stands up, he draws his sword, ready to fight for his Lord. And Jesus rebukes Peter. He tells him, put your sword away, because that's not the way the kingdom of Christ is going to advance. But Jesus wasn't trying to turn Peter into a weak man, a spineless man. No, Peter would need to be strong and courageous, just in a different way. Peter would need to be imprisoned and beaten. He would need to stand before the authorities who had killed Jesus and tell them to their face, we're going to obey God, not you. Punish us as you will. That took strength. That took courage. And that's what meekness is. It is strength that is controlled and useful. Being meek is not being soft, it is being restrained. Meekness does not mean passivity. It means intentionality, acting not with impulse, but being thoughtful and decisive. The meek man is not easily offended or easily riled up. You can insult him, you won't get under his skin. He can take it. The meek man will act with boldness in the face of injustice. He won't sit in cowardice while others watch and do nothing. He is willing to stand alone if need be for the sake of truth. He's willing to put himself in danger for the sake of others. But he isn't a hothead. He doesn't pick fights. A meek man is quietly strong because he doesn't need to tell people how much of a man he is. He shows it by the way he conducts himself. The meek man is one who is so committed to the defense of truth that he's willing to die for it if necessary. Look throughout the history of the church at the martyrs. These are meek men. They aren't weak. They are the strongest sort of men. Men who were so restrained and humbly obedient to their Lord that they were willing to die for his name. So what is meekness? Well, if you want a succinct definition, here's how the Puritan Thomas Watson defines it. He says, meekness is a grace whereby we are enabled by the Spirit of God to moderate our angry passions. And for all followers of Christ, and particularly for men, this ought to be your goal. To be strong, but also to be controlled. To rule over your spirit, which is the deepest form of strength. To be controlled, strong, restrained, and kind. Like that powerful horse that's been subdued, we should be yielded to the control of the Spirit of God. Now, here's a really practical example of this for all of us as to what meekness might look like for you tomorrow. Okay, Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So Peter is writing to slaves here about how they are to obey their masters. And in the first century, as we explained before, slavery, not really race-based. It was often voluntary. You would have an arrangement with someone. You'd work for them for a period of time in exchange for a plot of land or something. And so if you were to apply this principle today, it's not really that unlike the employer and employee relationship where we agree to work for someone and receive compensation. And Peter says we are to treat those in authority over us with respect. And he says not just to the kind, to the gentle bosses, but also to the unkind, to those who are maybe rude or unfair. We should display restraint, and we should intentionally subject ourselves to them. And then here's the reason that Peter gives, verse 19. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. So God promises a blessing on those who have this attitude, who, mindful of God, choose to respond to unfair treatment with meekness. Verse 20. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So Peter says, follow the example of Christ, the example that has been set before you in Jesus' death, his unfair treatment, how he endured that with restraint, not with reviling and threatening, but with humble submission. Christ entrusted himself to God, and he endured unjust treatment. And Peter says, now you go do that at work tomorrow. Have that attitude of Christ. Be willing to submit yourself, even if it's not fair, to be restrained, rather than to act out of impulse or retaliation. Now let's talk for just a minute about the rest of our text here. Back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, most Christians think when you die that you go for all of eternity to either heaven or hell. That is the common conception. Heaven is, some place up in the sky somewhere, and maybe it's someplace outside of our universe. That's where you go. You float around with Jesus and the angels forever, which sounds better than hell, but still kind of hard to really look forward to because it's hard to imagine what that kind of existence would even look like. Well, then you read a statement like this, the meek will inherit the earth. Well, what does that mean? How does that fit into the heaven or hell paradigm? This is the sort of thing I suspect most people reading their Bible just sort of skip past quickly without giving it much thought. But clearly, Jesus says in verse 5 that these meek people, they won't go to heaven forever, they will inherit the earth. Now, 2 verses prior to this, you might have noticed, that Jesus said that the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, which most people I think would take to mean they go to heaven when they die. They go up into the sky. So then what is Jesus saying here? The poor in spirit go to heaven, but the meek stay here on earth. So some Christians are up in heaven forever. Some Christians are here on the earth. Obviously, this is not the case. Jesus is pronouncing a blessing on those who are a part of his kingdom, and these are the characteristics of Christ followers. Here is what it looks like to live as a disciple of Jesus. You're poor in spirit, you're meek, you're a peacemaker, and so forth. It's not like some Christians are called to be poor in spirit while others are called to be meek. No, these are descriptions of Christ followers. And similarly, the blessings are all things that belong to all of Christ's people. Those who are a part of the kingdom of God, they will see God. They will inherit the earth. They will be comforted. They will be called sons of God, and to them belongs the kingdom of heaven. So those who inherit the earth are also those who possess the kingdom of heaven. The problem here is with thinking of heaven as a fixed location up in the sky somewhere, like as if this is the earth and somewhere, beyond the sky, beyond space, that's heaven. That is the misconception. Heaven is not some location outside of our universe. Heaven simply describes the place of God's manifest presence. And one day, God is going to come down to earth and dwell in our midst. That is the eternal state. It is not up in the sky somewhere. It is here on earth, Christ ruling from Jerusalem over the whole world. After the resurrection of the dead, heaven will be reunited with earth as God makes his dwelling with man. This is our great hope that we are to look forward to. Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. So those who are a part of Christ's kingdom are those who inherit the earth, because the kingdom of heaven, the rule of God, is going to come down to our world. And this should help us understand what Jesus' announcement of the kingdom means. When Jesus comes into Galilee proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven has arrived, he clearly doesn't mean that he means to overthrow the Roman government. No, as Jesus explained to Pilate, his kingdom is not of this world. Christ's kingdom, then, is the rule of heaven brought down to earth. And the Sermon on the Mount is what it looks like when man submits to the authority of Christ and lives as a subject in his kingdom. And in the very next chapter of Matthew, right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to see Jesus teaching on the subject of prayer. And what does he tell us to pray? He says, pray that God's kingdom would come, which is defined as his will being done on earth just as it is in heaven. The will of God is done perfectly in heaven. And we're supposed to pray that it would be done just as perfectly here on earth. And when that is accomplished, when the whole world is in submission to Christ as King, he will come down and reign from Jerusalem over his whole world. Heaven and earth will become one and the same, because God's presence will be here with us on earth, and his will will be done perfectly. He will make his dwelling with man. And so, we will spend eternity, you could say, in heaven on earth. They are the same. We will be in God's presence under his perfect rule, but we won't be off in the sky somewhere. We will be here on earth. And so Jesus says, in effect, blessed are the meek. They will inherit the earth, and theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Let's pray together.